Welcome to the fourth installment of Democracy's Third Wave. A third reverse wave? By 1990, at least two-third wave democracies, Sudan and Nigeria, had reverted to authoritarian rule. The difficulties of consolidation could lead to further reversions in countries with unfavorable conditions for sustaining democracy. The first and second democratic waves, however, were followed not merely by some backsliding, but by major reverse waves, during which most regime changes throughout the world were from democracy to authoritarianism. In the third wave of democratization slows down, if the third wave of democratization slows down or comes to a halt, what factors might produce a third reverse wave? Among the factors contributing to transitions away from democracy during the first and second reverse waves were the weakness of democratic values among key elite groups and the general public. Severe economic setbacks, which intensified social conflict and enhanced the popularity of remedies that could be imposed only by authoritarian governments. 3. Social and political polarization, often produced by leftist governments seeking the rapid introduction of major social and economic reforms. 4. The determination of conservative middle class and upper class groups to exclude populist and leftist movements and lower class groups from political power. 5. The breakdown of law and order resulting from terrorism or insurgency. 6. Intervention or conquest by a non-democratic foreign power. 7. Reverse snowballing triggered by the collapse or overthrow of democratic systems in other countries. Transitions from democracy to authoritarianism, apart from those produced by foreign actors, have almost always been produced by those in power or close to power in the democratic system. With only one or two possible exceptions, democratic systems have not been extended by popular vote or popular revolt. In Germany and Italy in the first reverse wave, anti-democratic movements with considerable popular backing came to power and established fascist dictatorships. In Spain, in the first reverse wave, and in Lebanon in the second, democracy ended in civil war. The overwhelming majority of transitions from democracy, however, took the form either of military coups that ousted democratically elected leaders, or executive coups in which democratically chosen chief executives effectively ended democracy by concentrating power in their own hands, usually by declaring a state of emergency or martial law. In the first reverse wave, military coups ended democratic systems in the new countries of Eastern Europe and in Greece, Portugal, Argentina, and Japan. In the second reverse wave, military coups occurred in Indonesia, Pakistan, Greece, Nigeria, Turkey, and many Latin American countries. Executive coups occurred in the second reverse wave in Korea, India, and the Philippines. In Uruguay, the civilian and military leadership cooperated to end democracy through a mixed executive military coup. In both the first and second reverse waves, democratic systems were replaced, in many cases, by historically new forms of authoritarian rule. Fascism was distinguished from earlier forms of authoritarianism by its mass base, ideology, party organization, and efforts to penetrate and control most of society. Bureaucratic authoritarianism differed from earlier forms of military rule in Latin America with respect to its institutional character, its presumption of indefinite duration, and its economic policies. Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, and Brazil and Argentina in the 1960s and 1970s were the lead countries in introducing these new forms of non-democratic rule, and furnished the examples that anti-democratic groups in other countries sought to emulate. Both these new forms of authoritarian rule were, in effect, responses to social and economic development, the expansion of social mobilization and political participation in Europe, and the exhaustion of the import substitution phase of economic development in Latin America. Although the cases and forms of the first two reverse waves cannot generate reliable predictions concerning the causes and forms of a possible third reverse wave, prior experiences do suggest some potential causes of a new reverse wave. First, systemic failures of democratic regimes to operate effectively could undermine their legitimacy. In the late 20th century, the major non-democratic ideological sources of legitimacy, most notably Marxism-Leninism, were discredited. The general acceptance of democratic norms meant that democratic governments were even less dependent on performance legitimacy than they had been in the past. Yet sustained inability to provide welfare, prosperity, equity, justice, domestic order, or external security could over time undermine the legitimacy even of democratic governments. As the memories of authoritarian failures fade, irritation with democratic failures is likely to increase. More specifically, a general international economic collapse on the 1929-30 model could undermine the legitimacy of democracy in many countries. Most democracies did not survive the Great Depression of the 1930s, yet some succumbed, and presumably some would be likely to succumb in response to a comparable economic disaster in the future. Second, a shift to authoritarianism by any democratic and democratizing great power could trigger reverse snowballing. The revigoration of authoritarianism in Russia or the Soviet Union would have unsettling effects on democratizations in other Soviet republics, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Mongolia, and possibly in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia as well. It could send the message to would-be despots elsewhere, you too can go back into business. Similarly, the establishment of an authoritarian regime in India could have a significant demonstration effect on other third world countries. Moreover, even a major country does not revert to authoritarianism. Moreover, even if a major country does not revert to authoritarianism, a shift to dictatorship by several smaller, newly democratic countries that lack many of the usual preconditions for democracy could have ramifying effects, even on other countries where those preconditions are strong. If a non-democratic state greatly increased its power and began to expand beyond its borders, this too could stimulate authoritarian movements in other countries. This stimulus would be particularly strong if the expanding authoritarianism state militarily defeated one or more democratic countries. In the past, all major powers that have developed economically have also tended to expand territorially. If China develops economically under authoritarian rule in the coming decades and expands its influence and control in East Asia, democratic regimes in the region will be significantly weakened. Finally, as in the 1920s and the 1960s, various old and new forms of authoritarianism that seem appropriate to the needs of the times could emerge. Authoritarian nationalism could take hold in some third world countries and also in Eastern Europe. Religious fundamentalism, which has been most dramatically prevalent in Iran, could come to power in other countries, especially in the Islamic world. Oligarchic authoritarianism could develop in both wealthy and poorer countries as a reaction to the leveling tendencies of democracy. Populist dictatorships could emerge in the future, as they have in the past, in response to democracy's protection of various forms of economic privilege, particularly in those countries where land tenancy is still an issue. Finally, communal dictatorships could be imposed in democracies with two or more distinct ethnic, racial, or religious groups, with one group trying to establish control over the entire society. All of these forms of authoritarianism have existed in the past. It is not beyond the wit of humans to devise new ones in the future. One possibility might be a technocratic electronic dictatorship, in which authoritarian rule is made possible and legitimated by the regime's ability to manipulate information, the media, and sophisticated means of communication. None of these old or new forms of authoritarianism is highly probable, but it is also hard to say that any of them is totally impossible.